So we're coming up to the last keynote, and I've had so much fun getting these awesome keynotes here. You're in for a treat. So Aaron works at the most visited museum in kind of the world. 58 million visitors a year, right? Like seriously. So Aaron and I work together at the Smithsonian at the Cooper Hewitt. But Aaron's been one of the few people in the museum sector who is a provocateur who also writes code. Aaron was part of the original Flickr team. He worked at Samsung, at a Samsung-funded startup, and is obsessed with maps. Aaron's also an artist, and my household gets these beautifully drawn postcards. So Aaron really loves physical things, writes code, and perhaps is one of the most provocative museum people around. And he's here to provoke. It's his third time in Australia. I think this is the second time he's been here. So, yeah, let's see what happens, eh? Aaron.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to ACMI for inviting me to speak, and thank you all in the audience for coming to listen. In the interest of time, and because I am often prone to elaborate digressions, I'm going to stick pretty closely to my notes, and I'd like to start with a trio of quotes. The first is from the British designer Jack Schultz, who said, "No one cares what you do unless you think about it. No one cares what you think unless you do it." The second quote I believe to be by the English writer Zadie Smith, who said, "Anything which is presented as an inevitability is political." I've had a little trouble tracking down the exact attribution for this quote, but Zadie Smith is a good writer and a sharp thinker, so I just let her have this one. And the third quote is from the American sociologist Tressie McMillan Cottom, who said, "We probably need to give up the transactional nature of our hope and do the things that need to be done because it needs to be done." This was a comment made in the context of how to continue the struggle for civil rights in the United States following the 2024 election. But I think it's generally good advice applicable to most things in life. So, don't worry, I hear your silent groans and I share them. There is a lot to get through, so this part of the talk will be mercifully brief. As Seb alluded to, if I studied anything at all, I studied painting, and that was at a time when the web was starting to happen. And selling paintings on the internet seemed like it might be a viable alternative to shackling myself to the gallery system or living from one government grant to the other. And in that process, it quickly became clear that I had a vested interest in understanding how this thing called the internet worked. So in the end, not a lot of painting and a whole lot of experience on the internet. First, at a little mom and pop internet service provider on a small island with an annual population of 20,000 and a summer population of 150,000. Out of necessity, we were one of the very first ISPs to develop a comprehensive suite of web applications to allow customers to service their accounts because we simply didn't have the time or the staff to do it over the phone. In 2024, I joined Flickr, the global photo sharing website with millions of users and billions of photos. Flickr was the poster child for Web 2.0, and against some pretty steep odds, it's actually still around and just celebrated its 21st birthday earlier this week. I could spend all afternoon going through all the stuff we did, so I'm just not going to. From Flickr, I went to Stamen Design, which is a client services studio, and they really pioneered data visualization and digital mapping on the web. Stamen has done work with a long list of people you've all heard of, and some of that work has been accessioned into the collections of MoMA and the Smithsonian. Stamen is also where everyone learned that I am not a client services guy. But not before we launched Pretty Maps, a mapping project that really was aimed to try and figure out how far we could push online mapping and client-side rendering in the service of this idea that data could and should be treated like a bolt of fabric from which a universe of fashions might be cut. After that, as Seb alluded to, in 2012, I went to the Smithsonian, to the Cooper Hewitt, where along with a few other things, I helped design, develop, and manufacture the pen, which was a custom electronic hardware device that we gave to every user, along with all of its associated software systems. From 2015 to 2018, I worked at MapZen, which was a mapping company with the ambitious, really bordering on crazy, goal of recreating the entirety of the Google Maps stack using nothing but openly licensed software and openly licensed data. And after that, as Seb mentioned, I went to the San Francisco International Airport Museum. We are the world's only fully accredited museum. The museum was started in the early 1980s, and it has mounted over 2,000 exhibitions and has a permanent collection of 160,000 objects. With annual foot traffic approaching pre-COVID levels of 58 million passengers a year, and on target to reach 74 million passengers a year, we are literally the world's busiest museum. And even if only 10% or 15% of those passengers visit the museum, we have numbers that match the Met, MoMA, and the Louvre. At 15 to 20%, we outpace them easily. So we are, in fact, the world's busiest museum that no one knows about. And that's my role, to try and figure out how we might use the internet to address this dilemma. And to put that in slightly more concrete terms, we're trying to use the internet and the web. And when I say the web, what I really mean is cheap storage, fast retrieval, affordable compute, and a global network. Keep that in mind. There's a display layer too, but that's not always necessary, so I left it out. We're trying to use the web and the internet to connect everything across the history of the airport, not just the collection, but the airport itself, which will celebrate its 100th anniversary in 2027. In such a way that there's no part of visiting the airport, from the gate you are standing in, to the airline you're flying on, to the aircraft itself, to the place you're going to or coming from, such that it doesn't have a straight line back to the collection and the museum's programming. And these are the sizes of the teams at their highest number that I've worked with directly on these projects. So in fact, these numbers were often smaller. And there is a healthy debate to be had about whether any or all of these projects were understaffed. I tend to think they were, but not by much. And that's really important. I think the biggest failure in the staffing models for these projects is that they make transitioning from one group of principals to another difficult. And that's certainly something which becomes very acute when you are operating at the scale and velocity of something like Flickr. And in fact, those problems did occur eventually, and it was ugly. But we also scaled the damn thing to 5 billion photos with an engineering staff of 15 at most before that happened. So we can debate whether these teams should have been 2 or 3 times their size, but my point is that none of them needed to be 10 times as large, let alone 100 times as large. So if you remember nothing else from this talk, remember that these numbers are what possible, not easy, possible looks like. And before we go any further, and while the Pretty Maps project is still front of mind, I want to share a quick anecdote. Stamen made a series of prints from the Pretty Maps project in collaboration with a company called 20 by 200, including one of New York City. And one day I got a waiver request from the producers of a television show called Suits, asking whether they could use that print as background art on their sets. I thought about it for a minute, signed the waiver, and forgot about it. And so last year, I finally sat down and watched all 9 seasons of Suits. And I was delighted to see Pretty Maps show up in the break room of the legal firm where the series is set sometime around season 2. It's the orange amorphous blob in the middle of this screenshot. This screenshot is also one of only a handful of times over the course of the entire television series where they managed to hang the print right side up. And I like to think of this as a cautionary and humbling tale about that other amorphous blob we call success or making it. And hold on to that idea, because as this talk goes on, you might think it is about one thing or another, but really it is about how we measure and value success. And I'm going to have to keep talking faster now. So the common theme throughout all of this work, the larger motivation and the measure of success beyond any given day-to-day task or really even any project itself, has been the idea of creating conditions where things might be revisited. There is not enough time to talk about all of that work in detail, so I'm going to focus on 4 projects, and I'm going to try to be quick about it. I'm going to try. I'm proud of this work, and I am happy to speak at length about it with anyone who wants to after this talk, but I think that there is a more important conversation which brackets this work that needs to be addressed. It's more important than the handful of things I've done over the years. So as mentioned, in 2012, I moved to New York, joined Seb at the Cooper Hewitt. Up until that point, I had been growing more and more involved with the museum sector, but it was always as an outsider with no responsibility. So the chance to work with Seb and Bill Moggridge felt like a chance to roll up my sleeves and pitch in. And while it might seem like a provocation to want to talk about the pen 10 years after its launch, 5 years after it was pulled from the floor, and in ACMI of all places, it's not. The reason for talking about the pen is less about the pen itself than a whole series of beliefs that the pen forced us to give voice to as it was developed. Also, the pen and the lens, sorry Seb, are really just two sides of the same coin. Before we built the pen, we reimagined the museum's online presence, specifically the collection. And one day someone at the museum asked me, like, what are you trying to do? And I said, we're trying to get people to link to us. We're the National Design Museum, but when people want to link to an Eames chair, they link to Wikipedia. And Wikipedia's earned that, but we should aspire to the same thing. Ultimately, what we were trying to do was give every object in the collection a stable, permanent, and reliable home on the web. And I'm going to bang on that for the rest of this talk. We were trying to use the web to give these objects, which may or may not have had any meaningful metadata, or any imagery, weight and mass in the universe such that other things might be able to orbit around them. We were not specific in what that behavior should be. It would be different for everyone, and it could be as simple as sharing a link. But we were clear that these behaviors should be possible. We were designing for recall. And we were designing for recall because without that recall, nothing about the pen, the ability to tap, collect, and revisit objects after your visit would work. We were also designing for recall as a way to get out of people's way. We were designing the pen as a way to allow people to visit the museum without spending all of their time trying to figure out how to remember their museum visit. We all know this happens. After a second or third use, the pen was meant to dissolve into normalcy. The pen was meant to enable an experience, remembering, not to be the experience itself. For those of you who've never seen the pen, this is what it looked like. It was a custom-built capacitive stylus with a battery life of 28 days and an NFC radio on the back, which allowed visitors to collect stuff throughout the museum. We built this from scratch, and many people will tell you it was an expensive mistake. I am not one of those people. I don't think it was a mistake, and nor do I actually think it was overly expensive. Certainly not when you compare it to anything else the museum sector does, and certainly not when you amortize that cost and the learnings from the pen over time. We did, however, have to assume overall management for the project 18 months before it launched. That was not part of the plan, and it was very, very complicated. This is the how of what we did. These were all the moving parts. We did not anticipate having to do this, and as mentioned, it was a giant pain in the ass, but none of these vendors in isolation were coming to save us. And if that was the how, this is the why or the what of what we were trying to do. It was much less complicated. This is the piece that I worked on day to day. This is what powered the pen. Sometimes, we would say, it's functionally indistinguishable from the collections website, and there's a simple reason. It was the collections website. And this is what the external vendors worked on. They were free to operate as needed within the scope of their work, but that work ultimately would be layered on the work that we did. Put another way, our future work would not be dependent on their past work. Our ability to change or revisit the project would not be limited by their inability or, and again, we all know this to be true, their unwillingness to change. The pen was always a controversial project inside the museum, and it didn't survive COVID-19. That does not mean the pen was not popular with people. It was incredibly popular with people, just not people in the museum. And this is borne out in both the usage numbers and the conversion rates seen first at Cooper Hewitt and subsequently at ACMI with the launch of the lens. There is a demonstrable appetite on the part of visitors for this sort of thing. In 2016, Cooper Hewitt traveled the pen to London. And in many ways, this is what I am most proud of because I had absolutely nothing to do with this. I had moved back to the West Coast in 2015, so my only involvement was to answer some technical questions and offer encouragement. And that was the larger meta project of the pen, to put in place the human and technical and operational, by which I mean financial. This is always the undercurrent in these conversations. Capacity for the work to outlast and evolve beyond the team which created it. So after both Seb and I left the Cooper Hewitt, the people who were left took all of the work which had been done in the service of the reopening, and which as a matter of expediency was purpose fit for that reopening, and retrofitted into a white box implementation tailored for the London Biennale. Cooper Hewitt's contribution to the event was to allow visitors to use the pen to collect and revisit works from all the other participating institutions, and to develop a customized version of all the software and visitor services systems necessary to do that work. They did this in-house on staff time with a single external developer in between all their other responsibilities, and that work took a fraction of the amount of time the pen took to develop. So for those of you in the museum sector, I invite you to take a moment to imagine the size of the change order from an external vendor to do the same kind of work. In 2015, I returned to the West Coast in the private sector, working for a mapping startup called MapZen. We were trying to build the totality of the Google Maps pyramid, which is really an iceberg, as mentioned, using only openly licensed data and software. We were a research project inside Samsung, and for them, MapZen was a hedge against the annual licensing fees they paid for Google services like Maps on their phones. And earlier I mentioned the idea, the notion of stability and permanence for collection records on the web. That's what I did at MapZen, but for places. Basically the marriage of openly licensed coordinate data and the idea of stable permanent identifiers on the web. Not so much for geographies, but for coordinates and places. The work centered on the idea that we can usually agree a place exists, even if we disagree what the boundaries are. Or in the case of history, precisely because those boundaries and those ideas of place change over time. The point was to give the agreement that something exists, stability and permanence, rather than any specific details which may or may not be in debate. We give the thing we agree on weight and mass in the universe, which then allows all the disagreements to orbit it independent of interpretation. We called this work a gazetteer, which is just a fancy name for a phone book of places rather than people. We called this gazetteer Who's On First because I am a child. And speaking of children, if you or your kids have ever used the mapping functionality of Snapchat, it's full of Who's On First data. And unsurprisingly, we use Who's On First data extensively at SFO Museum. All of the work we did at MapZen was governed by something I referred to as the reset to zero principle. Imagine you and I have a business that depends on a third-party company, for example, MapZen, to provide mapping services. As is often the case, and was the case for MapZen in 2018, that company goes out of business. The next day, you and I come into the office, look at each other, and then ask, do I have the Google Map account information, or do you? And that's the reset to zero, the idea that you have no choice but to return to a vendor you don't really like, or whose cost is prohibitive, but for which there is no alternative because the alternative simply vanished overnight. I would like to believe that MapZen shut down with a reset to 5, but we didn't. The reality is that MapZen shut down with a reset to 2, maybe 3 in some cases, which is to say that all the projects we worked on at MapZen are still out there, are still being worked on as open source projects, and a few of them as commercial ventures in their own right. None of these projects are push-button easy enough to spin up without effort, but if you were inclined, you could run them on your own servers today. And that feels like a kind of slow, grinding progress. It was made possible by a very deliberate sensibility and an understanding of the fragility of the work we were doing, which informed how that work was done. We built the work in such a way that it might be revisited, even in the event of failure. And that is something I think the cultural heritage sector should take to heart. In 2018, I joined SFO Museum. And on my first day there, I was walking in the terminals with the deputy director and made a casual joke about how slowly things happen in museums, what we in the business affectionately refer to as museum time. The deputy director looked at me and with a straight face ventured that airport time might be slower than museum time. And in that moment, I wondered if I had made a terrible, terrible mistake. But I also think it's a good story because a museum in an airport forces a museum to think about time in a way that museums don't and don't want to, which is a convenient segue into a project I started working on a couple years ago to develop an in-house system for doing interactive wayfinding and routing at SFO. It's a very simple project. We are doing this using a simple network graph of nodes and waypoints mapping galleries and public artworks to common areas throughout the airport. We're not trying to create a network so sophisticated that a robot could deliver you coffee at your seat. We are trying to make something simple enough to get you to the middle of the boarding area so that you can look around and see a painting. The reason this work is important for SFO Museum is that if few people understand there is a museum at the airport, even fewer understand that there are 24 galleries and over 100 public artworks located throughout the airport. The airport itself is, in fact, the museum. The Wayfinding project is about developing the infrastructure and the interfaces to show people all the things they didn't even know they didn't see on their way to catch a flight. For example, did you know that there are 47 museum-related things between the hotel bar and gate B25? Did you know that there are prints by the artist Richard Diebenkorn in both the hotel lobby and the waiting area for gate B3 around the corner from the Vietnamese sandwich place? No one does. These are the things we're trying to surface for passengers. If few people understand that there is a museum in an airport, even fewer still understand that there are 24 galleries throughout the terminals. Almost no one knows that there have been even more galleries over time and that we have mounted over 2,000 exhibitions since 1980. This is the challenge. We are competing for people's attention as they are racing through the airport trying to catch a flight or managing any other number of distractions. And we will never win that competition, ever. Which means that we need to think about how we communicate these things to passengers, not on our terms and not on our schedules, but on theirs. So to that end, we've started experimenting with generating on-demand publications from wayfinding routes that people can print or download to their mobile devices to look at on the plane, after they've left the airport, or even before they've arrived. The idea being that this is the sort of thing a teacher might print for students before they come for a school visit, or something you might send to friends or family who you know will have a long layover at the airport. We've also started to generate e-books, EPUB books, which are better suited for mobile devices. And the thinking here is that when you finally arrive at the gate and have managed to catch your breath, you can request one of these books and download it before you get on the plane. We would like nothing more than for you to board the airplane with a 500-page ebook of not just the current stuff that's on exhibition that you didn't have time to see, but everything you didn't even know exists, everything you didn't even know we'd done. That would be amazing. We know and we actually expect people to leave the building. That in itself is unusual in museums. We also know that a meaningful number of people will fly back through or out of SFO again. What that means is we enjoy repeat visitation by default. I know, right? And so it is fostering awareness of the museum during those future visits that we are trying to promote. We've also been experimenting with some novel broadcast channels. In 2025, we all know that the reality of social media has turned the promise of social media into a raging tire fire. Despite that, there is actually a lot of interesting work being done by a lot of different people to try and recapture some of that promise while guarding against the awfulness of the moment. All of this work is still nascent, and the projects are full of confusing and sometimes stupid names. One of those projects is something called ActivityPub. ActivityPub is plumbing. It's plumbing built on top of the web, which coordinates the ability for independently operated services, for example, a collection of federated social media services, to exchange messages with one another in a decentralized manner. If that sounds a little bit like how email works, right? You can send email from Gmail to Hotmail and vice versa. That's because it is. That is often what ActivityPub compares itself to. The salient point here is that you don't have to run your own email or ActivityPub server, but you can, and it will still be able to interoperate with those people who don't run their own servers, who depend on a third-party service. So SFO Museum has built its own ActivityPub server for publishing social messages social media style messages. In doing so, it means that we can, and we have, created social media accounts for 60,000 objects in our collection, including this roll of Hello Kitty toilet paper from EVA Airlines. We also have 700 air sickness bags. If that sounds absurd, consider that this is just another, arguably better and more approachable way in which we lend the works in our collection weight and mass in the universe, and by which people might orbit them. Ask yourself which commercial social media service would allow you to create 60,000 accounts on their platform. Likewise, we have created accounts for 6,000 unique aircraft, identified by their tail numbers, that have flown in and out of SFO over the years. Every day, they pick a random flight they have flown and broadcast a message along with something in our collection related to that flight. And we have done the same again for all the terminals, past and present at SFO. They broadcast installation photos from exhibitions that have been hosted in that terminal. You might be able to see where this work is going. And if you look closely, you should be able to see that for all intents and purposes, these activity pub accounts are both the pen and the lens, but better. That is a story for another day, though. In the meantime, we have also been proactive in archiving our traditional social media accounts, particularly our Twitter and Instagram accounts, and hosting them on our own servers. Bao Li, who manages these accounts, has been doing this work for over 12 years. Bao's work represents a valuable contribution to the museum's programming and outreach that is worth preserving. And just as a parenthetical, we don't say that enough to our social media people, and we should. To highlight this work, we created a dedicated activity pub account to republish a random Instagram post every day, providing an avenue into the museum's past efforts for people who have only just discovered us. Where the initial activity pub server took about 2 weeks to build, stretched over the course of a couple months, this account and others like it take maybe an hour to launch. So like I said, creating conditions where things which may be revisited, and in developing the capacity to allow those conditions to bear fruit over time. And it was suggested to me that it might be useful for me to focus more on practice and less on theory for this talk. If the goal is to create belief around what is possible, we do that goal a disservice by not centering it in concrete proof and example. At the same time, the risk of simply standing up here and recounting tips, tricks, and war stories is twofold. First, it just gets kind of boring for everyone. Second, it's ultimately just a superhero story. As often as not, these stories end up being little more than 12 highly successful habits of some guy whose circumstances are not my own. And as a consequence, it becomes easier to dismiss anything said as not being applicable beyond the boundaries of the tale. So the rest of this talk is going to be less about day-to-day tactical strategies and more about the sensibilities and the means which allow the work to succeed in the first place. This part is important. It is a talk about why it is necessary to promote and nurture that work into a broader scaffolding by which the entire notion of a cultural heritage might outlast the reluctance and the fickleness of the present. Now, I have come to think that one of the defining characteristics of the modern condition is something I call the tyranny of the analog. Not analog like the media, but analog like the linguistic or conceptual parallel. And I chose the phrase tyranny of the analog deliberately to highlight the practice of associating whatever it is we are trying to promote by aligning it to the language most closely tied to the zeitgeist of the moment. But I'm not pointing fingers here. The worst part for me is that almost everyone does this, regardless of the subject at hand. In this way, everything we speak of starts to take on a uniformity of urgency, which aside from being unfair and unrealistic, is simply confusing. The theme of this symposium is broadly about infrastructure and sustainable systems, so I'm going to take a moment to try and articulate clearly what I mean when I speak about them. I think infrastructures are systems which make something else possible. They are something which enable higher order effects and which, for intents and purposes, can be taken for granted. Redundancies are complementary systems that accompany an infrastructure which are designed to address imagined failures. Resiliency, then, is the capacity to address and adapt to unimagined failures. Out of necessity, resiliency is less about codification than it is about tolerance and temperament because, in the moment at least, it traffics in the unknown. But an important characteristic of resiliency is precisely the understanding of what, not how, something we call infrastructure exists to accomplish. If we take as a given that systems may break or buckle under unforeseen circumstances, then a truly catastrophic failure is one where accomplishing a task outside of ideal conditions becomes impossible. In 2025, given the state of the world, we may be forced to accept, or at least prioritize, the idea that the internet is not as important as some other things which we hold, or need to hold, to be inalienable truths. The last time I spoke at ACMI in 2017, it was over there in that corner, I pointed out that all our work on or about the internet is predicated on constant on-demand electricity. We have seen, though, in our modern time, that when a Cold War turns hot, it isn't long before the power goes out. Just let that one sit for a second. As such, it seems reasonable to say that while the internet may not be redundant by design, it is becoming less and less clear how resilient it truly is. So even just as an exercise, it might be recognizing the what and the why of the internet that we have come to value, because the how is feeling a little bit tenuous these days. In a similar vein, these are 3 questions I have started asking people in the cultural heritage sector lately. What does digital mean to you? What is the measure of success for any given initiative labeled digital? How long are you willing and able to wait for success? Now, you would be forgiven for looking at these questions and thinking to yourself, these are the kinds of questions and answers reserved for mission statements, organizational platitudes, and large language models. You're like, this is why we made LLMs, so I don't have to answer these dumb questions. And that's sort of my point. This is how we have typically come to understand these questions and their answers, when in fact they are profoundly important, but meaningfully different from one organization to another. I actually think being able to answer these questions on one's own terms is probably the most important thing anyone in the cultural heritage sector can do for themselves, for their organizations, and for their peers. There are many equally valid answers to these questions, but because digital has been and remains the zeitgeist around which everything else orbits, we end up tossing around the same terms with completely different meanings and intentions. And the cultural heritage sector has had a bad habit of looking to the private sector to help answer these questions. I find fault with this practice not because the private sector has bad answers, but because they are rarely applicable to the cultural heritage sector. The problem with modeling everything on the private sector is simply this. There are as many companies as not who aren't thinking of an operational timeline longer than a few years. Sometimes that's because the marketplace doesn't respond to whatever they're offering, but as often as not, it is because they are businesses that are built to flip, to be sold or acquired by another company within a short runway, and that secondary company may or may not keep the business running. If this is your business model as a private sector venture, then you don't really care if it's the same business model as one of your vendors or your suppliers. All you care about is that they don't flip before you do. So you might be able to see where this is going with the cultural heritage sector. And part of the reason for raising these issues is to distinguish between cultural heritage organizations who see digital initiatives in the same light versus those that don't. The distinction is important because absent that clarity, it is basically impossible to talk about how we make any digital initiative sustainable or whether or not it's even necessary. Another important consideration about sustainability and this mismatch between the two sectors is hiring and staffing. Now, there are some private sector enterprises whose size and reach justifies their enormous headcount. But as often as not, in the private sector, and in particular the technology sector, hiring is a performative act. It is meant to signal size and strength to investors and to competitors alike. Sometimes people are hired for no reason other than to prevent them from signing with someone else. The cultural heritage sector is in no position financially to parrot these practices, but more importantly, we don't need to. Now, I take a pretty expansive view of what constitutes digital, encompassing automation, storage, retrieval, audience, community, networks, and everything in between. I also subscribe to the idea that success is measured both in the long game and in the systems and the structures which enable that long game to be financially and organizationally feasible. That's a big, big part of it. The reason I think this is important is because I believe the thing which distinguishes culture from entertainment is the act of revisiting. The distinction is not meant as a value judgment because there is a time and a place for both. The point is simply to recognize what distinguishes one from the other. And crucially, entertainment becomes culture all the time, but it is in the act of revisiting that that transformation occurs. What defines culture, then, is less the subject itself than the act of engaging with, of revisiting, that subject. As such, I believe the role and the function, the reason that cultural heritage organizations exist, is to foster revisiting. And if we are not doing that, then I think we need to ask ourselves, first, why do we exist? Second, what distinguishes us from common entertainment in a vast and oversaturated attention economy? And third, are we even remotely prepared to compete in that landscape? To that end, and this is important, I understand the web, whose distinguishing characteristic is asynchronous recall on a global scale, as the technology which makes possible revisiting in a way that has genuinely never existed before the web. That bears repeating. The web, not the internet, not email, not whatever custom algorithm or custom protocol Spotify uses to make music start instantly, the web is the how which makes the what, revisiting, possible in a way that was previously impossible. It makes things possible because the barrier to entry and the cost of distribution are as close to zero as they've ever been, certainly compared to what came before the web. This is not a very complicated argument. It's really just one about means. But it is exactly for this reason that the cultural heritage sector has a vested interest in understanding the web and the technologies and the staffing requirements which enable it as core functions of our missions, rather than just a service we outsource to satisfy the whim and folly of the present. Now, this is where it gets complicated. It's tricky because that whimsy is historically how the cultural heritage sector has approached its relationship with technology. We have a long history of latching on to whatever is new and shiny and trying to integrate it into our programming as a way to seem modern and relevant in the eyes of younger audiences. The results are predictable. But a funny thing happened about 30 years ago, and that was that the web happened. And it was the cool new shiny thing, so the sector quickly became enamored of it. But unlike most cool new shiny things that came before it, the web also happened to be the one technology most closely aligned with our values and the reasons we tell ourselves, or at least the public, that we exist. The web makes possible, like our missions at cultural heritage organizations, things which before were impossible or so financially prohibitive as to seem impossible. The web is not just cool, it's viable. And the internet and the web have realized a kind of taken for granted normalcy in a remarkable short amount of time. As someone who lived through that transition and who was and remains excited about the internet, I am happy that the post-internet generations are so called for a reason. The whole point of being able to take something for granted is not having to suffer through endless celebrations of its very being. The challenge, though, is by not doing that, even a little bit, I think we've forgotten those things which distinguished the web and made it so successful. The web is profoundly simple. It's nothing more than a network of connected but independent documents. And although we have engineered an eye-watering amount of complexity into web browsers, web pages are still something that everyone can do in an afternoon, and many people could write a rudimentary web browser in a weekend. The second reason is more important, and it is that the web was given to the world as a gift. It's hard to overstate how important that is. Tim Berners-Lee released the web with no licensing restrictions. He explained how web browsers and web servers were meant to communicate, and that was about it. Anyone was free to participate on their own terms, without the need to ask for permission or blessings, and without the need to pay tribute in order to do so. It's difficult to understand the impact of those actions in a world where the web is taken for granted and where we don't talk about what things looked like before the web. And another challenge is that we only have so much time in our lives for foundational myths, and the time it takes to reinforce them, before they become trite, tiresome, and ultimately tuned out. Put bluntly, stories about absence are a hard sell. And everyone likes to argue about what does or doesn't constitute an inflection point in human history, events which mark a separation between the past and the present, which I've noticed usually just is a shorthand for things we take for granted. So even if we agree that the web and everything it has made possible was a genuine inflection point, it is still not the new shiny thing anymore, and another characteristic of the modern condition is that we are all addicted to inflection points. Everyone wants to be present at the moment of creation, to say, I was there, rather than simply inheriting the scars and war stories of someone else's past. And one of the ways this dynamic has manifested itself when it comes to the web and the internet in general is the idea that if you share or publish or do anything online and it is not immediately successful or viral, then it is deemed a failure. As a result, everything we do strives to become its own manufactured inflection point, which is insane on simple first principles, but it also ignores just how difficult and prohibitive it used to be to publish anything with the equivalent reach of the internet before the web. Now, massive worldwide overnight success is sometimes referred to as hockey stick growth, and it's a good story. If you happen to be party to it, like I was at Flickr, it can be rewarding as it was challenging. But it is also not normal. We need to remember this. It's just not normal. There are many reasons why it's not normal, but let me focus on one. Sometimes it simply takes a while for people to warm up to an idea. What the web has made possible are the economics of keeping something which has not enjoyed hockey stick growth, around long enough for people to warm up to it, or to survive past the moment when people have grown tired of it. If your goal is to build something which is designed to flip inside of 10 years, things like this may not seem like a very compelling argument. If, however, your goal is to build something to match the longevity of the cultural heritage sector, to meet the goal of fostering revisiting, or for novel ideas to outlast the reluctance of the present, and to do so at a global scale, or really any scale larger than shouting distance, then I would challenge you to find a better vehicle for doing so than the internet and the web in particular. And in its simplest form, the technical architecture of the web consists of a document layer, the stuff you see in a browser, and a transport layer. The craziest part about the transport layer for me, which most people don't see, is that it underpins nearly everything these days, whether or not it's used to deliver web pages. The simplicity and the open licensing means it has become the de facto transport standard for everything. And even when a service or product develops a custom transport mechanism, as often as not, they still end up using a web rendering layer for their graphical interfaces. Now, as a general rule, plywood and 2x4s are the structural underpinning of everything in the built environment, regardless of how posh, luxurious, or expensive the surface trappings are. This building is a good example. This building wouldn't exist without plywood and 2x4s. And in the same way, at least one, but usually both, of the core technologies that define the web still run most of what we call modern, despite it being old and outdated. Crucially, the reason that plywood, 2x4s, and the web are important is not because they self-assemble. They don't. They're important because the qualities which define them make the process of assembling and reassembling affordable in time, money, and cognitive overhead. They are the means, not the ends. That may not seem sexy or exciting until you consider that the alternative, for the cultural heritage sector at least, is usually vendor lock-in and six-figure change orders. Everything I have worked on, all the work I've shown you and I haven't shown you, takes the web as a foundational layer. The web is what makes it possible for teams as small as those I've described to do the work they do. The web is also what makes it possible to weather bad mistakes and decisions. Not web pages or web servers per se, but the ease of production, deployment, and distribution paired with licensing, or more importantly, not having to worry about the cost and the burden of renegotiating that licensing. This is what allows ideas to be made manifest on a schedule and a budget that can make even failed executions viable because it proves or disproves something which otherwise would have remained a hypothetical. I think we've all been there. And if there was one lesson, one software engineering lesson that I took with me from Flickr to the Cooper Hewitt and every place since, it is this. The speed with which a code base can change is the most important consideration above all else, which means three things. First, it is taken as a given that sooner or later circumstances will necessitate change. That might be a security issue. That might be features suddenly becoming the most important thing in the world, where last week no one wanted them. It might be you should be so lucky, sudden and unexpected growth. Second, time is still a finite constant. So when we are talking about the need for change, we are gating that change inside of a boundary. Finally, it is more valuable to prioritize temperament over codification. That last comment is the kind of thing you say when you want to start a holy war in software engineering and management circles. Lots of people will disagree with me about that, and in some cases they will be correct. Lots, if not all, product development trends towards commodification. And codifying the boundaries of what something can or can't do is an important part of that. This is the process of taking the work of an individual and turning it into the work of arbitrary replaceable cogs. But this is why I have spent as much time as I have trying to drive home the necessity of being able to answer the question of what digital technologies mean and are meant to accomplish for you and your organization. If the goal is no more ambitious than something which produces passive income generation, then by all means, codify away. But if the goal is to develop a capacity which can adapt to the operational, financial, and intellectual churn of the cultural heritage sector, not to mention culture itself, then I don't see how we cannot preference temperament. Which brings me to this guy. I was told there are some things we don't talk about here, so I am not going to mention he who shall not be named by name. But I don't think it's possible to talk about or understand the technology landscape, and in particular the software development landscape of the last 10 to 15 years without talking about this guy. I wake up every morning trying to imagine a world where this guy never happened. Because I think at its core, this guy's story is impossible not to understand as anything but a celebration of the class system at best and the caste system at worst. I know these are fighting words because lots of people grew up with this guy, but I don't really know how else to understand the voluntary submission of oneself to a magical sorting hat, except to say that it was probably the canary in the coal mine of artificial intelligence that we've all fallen into in 2025. And as if that weren't bad enough, the world is then further reduced to wizards, and let's not mince words, wizards and untouchables, whose only hope in life is to be graced by the presence and noblesse oblige of their betters, akin to a moral human in the presence of an invisible Greek god. His is a story of rote learning and codification, dressed up as magic and spellcasting in the service of Crystal Palace worldviews and uniform organizing principles metered out by the benevolence of its practitioners. These are attractive, Father knows best, power fantasies for a lot of people. but especially people working in technology. And so we see the craft and rituals of an anointed tribe of very special people metastasizing into what Kellen Elliott McRae, in his excellent series of essays titled Software and Its Discontents, calls aspirational complexity. He writes, "As an industry, we've always been enamored with new technology and shiny objects. For years, it was almost definitional. Otherwise, why did you go into this industry? Interestingly, even as the job is mainstreamed, the infatuation with complexity has remained and even grown. First, complexity lies at the heart of our industry's mythologies. New people joining the industry are taught our myths about Google, Facebook, Amazon, in the sense that these companies' approaches are what software is supposed to look like. And fewer people are in a position to have a wide enough scope of responsibility to learn pragmatic counter lessons the hard way. Second, during the era of abundance, when OpEx was easier to deploy than CapEx, cloud and software as a service exploded. These services come backed with a significant marketing budget whose job is to convince you that the complexity is necessary. Why deploy a database when you could deploy a non-relational data cluster? Why deploy a server when you could deploy a Kubernetes cluster? Why build a simple web page when you could use React? We've developed an aesthetics of complexity, the sense that a good system is a complex one, and that if you aren't on the latest technology, you're wasting your time and potentially damaging your career. So the recent history of technology software development has become a story about the short-term overindulgence and bedazzling of a group of people, you've all heard these terms, rock stars, ninjas, 10x engineers, with he who shall not be named as mascot and marketing parrot. A group of people who we are coming to see were probably also just foot soldiers and cannon fodder for the training sets of machine learning and artificial intelligence projects and the long-term planning of a larger private sector initiative to document, codify, and replace most human workers. In case it's not clear, everything about the last slide, from top to bottom, was a deliberate provocation. In doing so, I am opening myself up to the critique that in its simplest form, I am just an old man shouting at the sky. I am not here to deny the future or progress or novelty. I am here to point out that futures are not inevitable, and that futures which are marketed to us as inevitabilities ought to be treated as suspect. They ought to be treated as political. I am here to call bullshit on a rhetoric of the future which seems to depend on erasing everything which came before it simply because it is not the future, or in that most cherished phrase of the technology class, modern. I am here to call bullshit on a future which sacrifices the real and genuine advances of the past, things which made a meaningful difference in how we live our lives and what we are able to accomplish for passing conveniences and novelties whose costs are unknown or, as is often the case in 2025, deliberately obscured. The reason it is important to speak about these things is to try and make you believe that it doesn't have to be this way. It never did. It is easy to look around in 2025 and feel like the web has been outpaced, and in many ways it has. That's the nature of technology. But it often feels like the web is gaslighting itself or being made to gaslight itself. Another way to understand the web, though, is that it represents a tiny break, or at least a quivering, in a long march towards corporate walled gardens and vendor lock-in that started almost as soon as long-distance telecommunications, if not the Industrial Revolution, became a reality. It's important to recognize that none of the established media or telecommunications companies imagined the web. If they imagined anything like the web, it was a crippled version reflecting the fears and desires of the marketplace rather than anything people wanted to use. That doesn't mean people didn't use those offerings, but the speed with which they were abandoned the moment the web came along should tell us something. The web happened to these companies, and ever since that moment, they have been maneuvering to fence it back in and make it something they can control and shape. If you are lucky enough not to have had to live through the insanity that Microsoft inflicted on the world with Internet Explorer 6, then you are lucky. It means you've only had to live through the insanity that Google has wrought with Chrome, the crippling lack of functionality for web applications and iOS devices, or the bitter seeds that Facebook has sown with React, or Twitter not allowing links to Instagram, or Instagram to Twitter or to TikTok. The list goes on, right? The companies change, but the behavior is the same. But it is also not simply enough to point fingers and lay blame at the feet of the platform vendors. We are long past the moment where we need to admit that we did this to ourselves. Where this is the Faustian bargain with technology platforms whose behavior we have conveniently unseen in the service of reach, reward, and imagined audiences, instead of doing the hard work to develop internal capacity. We are being forced to pay for that bargain now. And as part of that reckoning, it's worth remembering that the web that was new and shiny and full of promise, never went anywhere. But like plywood, it does not self-actualize, nor does it self-discover. And this seems to be the elephant in the room right now. The reason I keep stressing the importance of understanding and articulating what digital technologies represent for an organization is that I think for many of them, those technologies are seen as little more than the cost of getting noticed. They are the means to mask the stark reality that we don't know how to stand out or how to champion our programming in a media landscape that resembles the microplastics which occupy every part of the food chain in our bodies now. And the idea of the web outside of established and reliable discovery channels is a difficult prospect for everyone. If we only imagine the web as the output of benevolent corporate overlords who promise us to not be evil until they are, then I agree, things might seem a little bit grim right now. The original promise of reach and discoverability, the illusory and often false promise of overnight success, of maybe even going viral, is being undermined on all fronts. And worse still, the alternatives, which are beginning to occupy those spaces, are even less certain and more transactional in their nature. And so if we want any chance of escaping this quicksand, I think we are all collectively going to have to reimagine what discovery means and how its success is measured in both time and impact. I think we are going to probably need to spend a little more time than we have in the past telling ourselves, our peers, and our audiences why the web is different, why it is special and worth preserving even if it lacks the sparkle, shine, and immediacy of the new, because the alternatives are looking pretty retrograde right now. We go where the eyeballs are, we tell ourselves, to try and figure out where the cool kids are. And then in our digital efforts, we crash the party like an awkward dad. You won't believe what happens next. We do this instead of simply being good at what we do, because we are good at what we do. And in finding ways to make being patient enough for people to discover that work a practical and an operational and a financial reality. And then to make those realities durable enough to foster discovery and revisiting on a timescale of the humanities, not the marketplace. And in the meantime, we risk abandoning the one platform that was, and still is, purpose-built to make those kinds of efforts possible. Now, I have 1 minute and 20 seconds, so I'm going to ad-lib this. So this arrived on my doorstep last month. It came all the way from Australia, so I feel like I'm bringing it home. This is amazing. This is what gives me hope. This is a refashioned, original iPod scroll wheel music player. This was developed just up the road in Sydney. It costs $250. It is both the software and the hardware specs are open source. I said that it cost $250, and what that means is that even after materials, like this is being sold with regulatory approval in a foreign country. It has a screen that can be replaced, a user interface that people know and love, 2 terabytes of storage, Bluetooth connectivity, an operating system that can be repurposed, and none of the surveillance capitalism that has infected every other part of our lives. That's amazing. This is what we can do now, and this was made by 4 randos in Sydney. So I'm going to try and ad-lib this. I'm just going to keep going until someone tells me to stop. I'm also going to leave this because this was the last quote, and I really think that if you take nothing else away from this, take this. We need to give up the transactional nature of hope. We are living in a world where we need to do things because they need to be done. And come and talk to me about this afterwards. I can go on forever, but it's fantastic. Good work, Australia. Thank you. Are we going to do this?
Yeah, let's do this. We'll do it. We're going to just push the break back a couple of minutes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, it's called the Tangara.
After the train, right?
I don't know.
It was a train. It was a train. I grew up in
They left that off their website.
Oh, inspirations. Look, thanks so much, Aaron. I think, it's such a good way to, you bring back some of the things that Deb was talking about at the start too, and throughout this. And I think, there's a question here that Deb C. yesterday referred to the need for justice with infrastructure and technology, and the question is, how can it be secured? And I wonder whether what you're showing is that in fact we need to use and build and maintain the infrastructures we have with something like the web. It requires people and it requires doing the work.
Yeah, it requires 2 things. It requires people and people to do the work. There are many technical challenges. If you want to talk about securing it, there's a lot of work that people have done around what's affectionately referred to as little nets or little networks. That happened at Occupy in New York in 2012. But it also really depends on belief. If I wasn't clear, one of the things that I really wanted to sort of push back on is this idea that our relationship with technology is simply in service of what is new and shiny. Like we think about this in this sort of transactional nature, that this is what will attract people, and one, that's just not true, and 2, we are painting ourselves into a corner. And let me tell you, the technology companies are getting pretty good at never letting you leave.
Yeah, when you joined the Smithsonian, I remember you talked about this belief stuff a lot, and you got very annoyed that the Smithsonian didn't believe that it had the remarkable things it had, and it was doing all this work to attract younger audiences and all of this, but actually leaving the core things that made them interesting and different to the side. I think our whole sector is guilty of this, and we often have long discussions about this. How do we break out of that? We've got a panel coming up next with four institutions that are doing really interesting things. But how do we get that work to fundamentally change that belief in us being not as confident about the value of the work we do?
I mean, that's a big question, and I don't think that I'm equipped to answer it in its totality. I think there's a lot of ways, but I think by just doing the work, right? By demonstrating that we can do these things with our collections, and we can do them quickly, we can do them affordably. It doesn't, these things don't have to be 6-month projects. And really what people just want is access, and they want to participate. So I went out for lunch with some people from ACMI the other day, and I was saying, like, you guys are so lucky you work for a film museum, right? That's almost as good as a design museum. Design museums, we were like, we get everything, like everything is ours. But film, like, you have the most enthusiastic fans out there, and Again, I think that's really why I've tried to make this distinction between entertainment and culture. Not the distinction, but the thing which defines it, which is revisiting.
Can you just unpack that? What does revisiting a film mean? What does revisiting this mean?
I mean, revisiting it just means watching it again. We listen to the same piece of music over and over and over again. If you want a big name to associate with this, the example is Glenn Gould, who re-recorded the Goldberg variations at the end of his life. Or Francis Bacon, who repainted the last painting he ever painted was the first painting he ever painted. And it's valuable to see those two things side by side. We read the same books, we watch the same television shows. That is that process. The other thing I've said a lot is the bedrock of humanities is debate. And debate is that idea of reconsidering and tossing something around and seeing it from a different angle. And it's not just this sort of fire and forget approach to life. I could keep going, but
I think that's a very good place to end because it captures, I think also what particularly social media now encourages us to do is fire and forget, and debate is lost. The space is not there for that.
So I'm going to take advantage of the fact that no one will kick me off the stage while you're here, and just say that I was talking to someone yesterday about their kids' social media consumption, and it was a sort of like endless scrolling stuff. And the question I had, and I'm genuinely curious, I think anyone who has kids should ask their kids the same question, which is, do the kids see patterns? Are they aware of patterns as they've been scrolling infinitely for weeks on end? Because I would wager that they do. And I think that's important to remember, because right now the narrative, the rhetoric around social media is that the sky is falling and their kids are idiots and will never be able to accomplish anything in their lives, and I don't think that's true.
It's the awkward dad thing again. Parental anxiety.
I mean,
that's a whole other conference, though.
Yeah, you should just do a whole conference on awkward dad, or not.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you very much.